This is a sermon from Hounslow Town Church. We meet every Sunday at 9:45 in the Arts Center, located in the Treaty Center on Hounslow High Street. For more information and resources, please visit hounslowtownchurch.org.
In this account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, this story, I think, I want to argue, is the perfect story because it has these three essential elements to it about the life of Jesus. And as we think about the life of Jesus, we can take confidence in these three things. They are, is it true? Does it work? Does it work in explaining the way the world is? And does it satisfy your soul? In other words, as a minister, as a preacher, when I come to a text like this, I think, yeah, I want to preach this. Because it's true, it explains the way the world is, and it sings, it satisfies our soul. And so when you evaluate philosophies of the world and religions of the world, I want to argue these are the three gold standards. Is it true? Is it actually true? Does it explain the world in which we live in the best way possible? And you see this, you think, yeah, this is how the world is. And lastly, does it change and satisfy you? And so that really is our outline. I think in Mark's account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see these three things, that the gospel correctly tells us true history. We'll see that in verses 32 to 35. And then, secondly, the gospel correctly diagnoses our condition, the way the world is. We see that in verses 36 to 40. And lastly, and this is the title of the sermon, the gospel correctly tells us of the love that we've always wanted, that our hearts long for. We see that love in this passage today. So first, let's consider history. Is this true? By that I mean, did it really, really happen? And I want to argue that it did, and I think we see this in verses 32 to 35. Let me read our passage again. And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. So I'm arguing right now that this is true. And I want to argue these three things for why it's true. First, I think we can say we know this is true because this happened in a real place. It happened in a real place. So outside of the city of Jerusalem, outside the city walls, is a mountain. It's there today. It's called the Mount of Olives. Now, logically, right, if there's a mountain of olives, do you want your press at the top or at the bottom? You want it at the bottom, right? You harvest the olives from the trees and you bring the olives down to the bottom, and that's where your press would be, and you press it, and then you take away the olive oil. If the press was at the top, you'd have to carry the olives all the way to the top of the mountain, right? And then you'd have to carry the olive oil down the hill, down the mountain. That's a lot more work. The press is at the bottom of the mountain. This was a real place. You can go see these things today. And so as we read this account, we have to ask ourselves, is this true, or did somebody make up this story? Is it fiction? Answer, this is a true place. This is a real place. If someone made up this story, and the accusations about the Bible are that they were made up many years later in places that were far away from Jerusalem where these events took place, someone far away would not know these details. These details are here, and they show us that Mark thought this was believed that this really did happen. He included real places in it. Mark was writing with Peter. Mark is the author, but Peter was with him when he wrote this. And we know that we can have confidence that there was an eyewitness there to these events because Peter was there. Second reason I want to argue that this is true is because Peter, who was there when these events go down, Peter looks really bad in this story, doesn't he? Jesus 3 times said, Peter, stay awake. And, well, he said that's all of them. But in the second time, he calls out Peter. Verse 37, he focuses on Peter. He says in verse 37, Simon Peter, are you asleep? Can you not watch 1 hour? Again, if Peter were writing this story, why would he make himself look bad? Right? Why would you make up a story in which the chief leader of your church, many years later, who's Peter, why would you make him look silly? Why would you make him look weak like this? No, you make him out to be a hero. Unless these things really happened. Unless Peter was really there. And unless Jesus really said to Peter, Peter, why are you sleeping? Can you not stay awake? The last reason this is true is because Jesus, like Peter, also looks bad in this story. I have to explain this a bit, but Jesus, as he's dying, as he's facing his death, he doesn't die in the way that a hero faces death in the ancient world. All right? Jesus dies, he's approaching his death in which he's greatly distressed and troubled. And in the ancient world, this would be very shameful. You wouldn't want, if you were making this up, you would not write this story in a way in which you would bring unnecessary shame upon the leader. No, you would want to make Jesus look the best that he could. And yet here is Jesus being undone. And that's not the way that heroes would die in the ancient world. Here are a few examples. Socrates, who's a famous Greek philosopher, when he died via poison, he died with confidence that his honor was intact. He didn't show any emotion. He didn't cry. He wasn't sweating blood. He died very stoically. Stephen, in the church, Stephen, the first martyr that we read about in Acts, he died when he was stoned. He died in worship. He didn't die crying. He died in worship. He died, you could say, with honor, as it were, in the ancient world. Another martyr named Polycarp, who was a famous disciple of John, he was put to the fire. He died as a martyr in fire. And he said this before he died. He said, "You threaten me with fire which burns for an hour and is then extinguished. But you know nothing of the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. Why are you waiting? Bring on whatever you want." Right? See, in the ancient world, that's how heroes died. They died with honor. They said, "Bring it on." And yet, here is Jesus. So different as he's facing his death. He's coming undone, sorrowful, distressed. Again, if you're making up a story to convince the ancient world that you, ancient world, should follow Jesus, you don't make Jesus out to be a hero who's so weak, who has tears when he's facing his death. You wouldn't write a story like this. Again, unless it's true. And so historians who read lots of ancient documents, like the Gospel of Mark, when they read this, they say this is true. It has other stories that we know are myths, that we know are fiction. We can tell by the details. We can tell by things like this that other stories are not true. But this, historians, scholars, universally will agree this is a true story. These events really did happen. So not only is it true, but this story, secondly, it also correctly shows us our human condition. It correctly shows us the way of the world. It paints an accurate picture of what you and I are like when we don't have the transforming work of God in our lives. And what's that condition? What's the picture that it paints? Well, here it is in a nutshell. The three most senior leaders of Jesus' community, they're found asleep. That's the picture of reality. At the time when Jesus most needs them, these three guys, they are asleep. They are unable to do what Jesus needs them to do. They're absolutely unable. They're absolutely unfaithful. So Jesus calls to himself 12 disciples. And he picked 12 to form this new humanity that we call the church, with Jesus as the head. And he was with them for 3 years. And amongst those 12, he pulled aside three leaders of the 12, Peter, James, and John. And these three got extra treatment, extra training. They had an extra special relationship with Jesus. They were able to see things that the other 12 weren't. Like, they saw him transfigured. And if you weren't here when we studied that was when Jesus showed on a mountain, he showed his divine nature to them. He glowed with a light emanating from him. And so we see Jesus then as being fully God, fully man. And only those three saw that. So they had extra special discipleship, extra special training. And yet now, when Jesus says, I need you to stay awake and pray, what's their condition? They're asleep. They're sleeping. And surely, this is the best diagnosis right here in our passage of the universal human condition. That we are unable to do what God wants us to do. Surely this is the best description. I mean, think of this. Bring out your best. Select 3 of your heroes. Train them for 3 years. Invest in them. Get them ready. And what happens when it most matters? It is time of greatest need. When the race is about to start. These 3 have been fully trained. When the gun is about to go off, when the race is about to start. How do we find these 3? They're unable to stay awake. They're unable to pray with Jesus. Unable to be found faithful in the most simplest of things. Surely this is the human condition. So can I ask you, does this not ring true? Is this not the correct diagnosis of your spiritual condition? There is a part of you that wants to do what's right, and yet the rest of you absolutely cannot pull it together. Jesus shows us this, right? Look at verse 38. He says, the spirit is indeed willing. There's a part of you that wants to do what's right, but the flesh is weak. The body, while you want to, the body just doesn't let you. There may be times when I want to do what's right, but my flesh or my desires, my will, they just don't come through. They don't have the ability to make it happen. What Jesus is describing here for us about the human condition is what theologians down through the ages almost universally call the doctrine of total depravity. Now, that's a big word, but here's what it means. It means that as humans, we have been affected by sin, and all that we are has been affected. That's the total depravity. That it's not what's called utter depravity, meaning that all that you do is depraved. No, that's not what I'm saying and what it teaches. It's saying total, all that you are as a human being has been affected by sin. So your mind has been affected, meaning that you don't always think properly. Your mind can be deceived by sin. And your will, your heart, your desire to act has been affected. Your will doesn't always act in the way that it should. Your desires have been affected by sin. So that your desires aren't always pure. And then your actions and your behavior have been affected as well. This is the doctrine of total depravity. That sometimes what our minds may want to do, our bodies just don't carry on with, and so forth. See, isn't this not true of the way of the world? We know that we live in a world that is broken. I mean, Lindsay rattled off a whole bunch of things that we're praying for. We all know, no one will argue that the world in which we live in is broken. Where we have differences is the reason for that. So in the political sphere, on the left, liberals will say The reason that the world is broken is because the systems of the world are broken. And if we can just fix the systems, then the world will be saved. And on the other side, the right, the conservatives, say no, the problem is actually everyone else is broken, but not me. Everything, not the systems, but the people are broken. But conservatives know they would never turn on themselves and say, but I'm not broken. Nationalists they're like the conservatives in that they say all the other races of the world are broken, but not my race. We're fine. The rest of them are broken, but not us. But we know what you see in how I describe that, how those all are wrong, right? It's so obviously wrong, because none of them, no politician is ever going to speak the truth. Which politician is going to say what's truly wrong with the world is you, the voter? Who's going to say that in our political sphere? We want to blame shift and blame someone else. But what this passage shows us, what it diagnoses, is that the condition that we each have, the problem that's wrong with the world, it begins with me. It begins with you. You know, when I was young, I was 12, I had a very serious bicycle accident. I was riding, and I fell off my bike. I was going down the hill. I believe I was going fast. I believe, I don't remember it, but I was going fast, and I fell over. I landed on my head, yeah? I had all kinds of cuts on my head and on my shoulder. I was losing my memory. I was talking nonsense. And I came home. Someone drove me home. And thankfully, my mother said something seriously wrong and took me to the medical establishment. And in that instance, the doctors could have done one of two things. The doctors could have looked at me and said, oh, you have cuts on your head. We're going to give you some plasters. You'll be fine. Head home. Now, if they had done that for a head injury, right, I would have died, right? Because a head injury, we know there could be something wrong where? On the inside, right? And thankfully, they said, we need to do a scan for this poor 12-year-old Barry, because there could be something wrong. There could be a bleeding on the brain on the inside. A correct diagnosis is everything, isn't it? And so thankfully for me, they gave a scan. They did a scan. And they saw bleeding on the brain. And that's why I have this scar here, because I had surgery to fix all that, right? A correct diagnosis is life-saving. Here's the diagnosis that we have for us of our spiritual condition. God's diagnosis says, you and I, apart from God waking us up, we are spiritually asleep. We are unable to do what God asks of us. We're unable to love him. We're unable to love him, to love one another. Now, that's the bad news. But here's the good news, right? Thankfully, God saves us. And he doesn't leave us in that state. And what he does, we see here that he shows us of a love. He saves us in such a way that we can say, this is the love that our hearts, that we have always longed for. So we see this, verse 36. We see this love here. Jesus saying, crying out to God, Abba, Abba, Father. Abba is a personal name of God. It's like Dad. Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Jesus is talking about this cup. He's talking about the cup of God's wrath. Throughout all the Bible, that's what the cup meant. It's the cup of God's wrath. And it's the cup in which God says of how he will deal with sin and evil, that he will pour out the cup of his wrath upon sinners. And yet Jesus here in the garden, Jesus who was innocent, who lived a life of no sin, here we find Jesus telling God he's going to drink this cup. And as he faced that fact, he was in much agony. You know, unlike all the other martyrs who died heroically, here Jesus is coming undone. And the reason for that, why he's not like Stephen and Polycarp and the others, the reason he's coming undone here, the reason we read in Luke that he actually bleeds, his sweat has blood in it. The reason that he's in such agony is because the effects of him drinking the cup of God's wrath, Bible scholars say, began then in the garden. And that meant that he wasn't just facing death, but he's facing something even worse than death. And that's the wrath of God. His death would mean that he would be forsaken by God, that his relationship with God would be darkened, meaning that he would no longer know the joy of the Father, of his heavenly Father towards him. So he's feeling darkness of the soul that was descending upon him. And so he prays, God, take this cup from me. Imagine that agony. Imagine the agony of that. Someone you've loved from eternity past, knowing that you're about to be forsaken by. Imagine that. Imagine that. And yet, what does Jesus say? Here's where we see an incredible love for you, his people. He says, take this cup from me. But then he says, and here's love, he submits his will. He submits his will, his human will, his human desire to avoid the suffering. He submits that to the will of God the Father. He aligns his will with God's will. In other words, he willingly, he chooses, he voluntarily chooses to drink the cup of God's wrath. So why? Why go through the suffering? Well, there's only one answer. He did that out of love for you, his people. He did that in order to save you from your sin, in order to wake you up out of your slumber and make you spiritually alive. Notice that he could have escaped, right? He's alone. Everyone's asleep. There's no eyes on him. He had the perfect chance to make a runner. He doesn't. He chooses to stay. 3 times everyone was asleep with no other eyes on him. 3 times he could have gone, but he didn't. He chose to stay. This last week in our life group, we were studying Genesis 3. And for those of you who've not read it, it's the story of how Adam and Eve fell in the garden. And there's a really interesting comparison between what happened in that garden, the Garden of Eden, and this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. Yeah? Jesus, some of you may know this, that Jesus is called by Paul, he's the second Adam. So work with me here. In the first garden, in the Garden of Eden, there's Adam, and there was a tree. And in the second garden, there's Jesus, the second Adam, and the cross is often called a tree. Yeah, so there's a tree in both of these gardens, and there's the first and second Adam. And in the first garden, in the Garden of Eden, God said, don't eat of that tree. Obey me, don't eat of that tree. If you do, you'll be cursed. In the second garden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus knows he's about to go to a tree. And yet on that tree, he does what Adam didn't do. Adam, we know, disobeyed God. And yet Jesus, the second Adam, he obeyed God to address the curse that Adam brought on the first one. Do you see what Jesus did? He willingly chose to drink the wrath of God. He willingly chose to suffer. Why? In order to save you. In order to show his love for you. It means that Jesus would rather lose himself than lose you, his child, his brother, his sister. You see, that is the love that our hearts long for, to be loved like that. To know that someone could have done a runner to save his own skin, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to suffer in order to love you and save you. You see, that love is powerful. That love can transform you. That love can break and melt and transform your heart. And so in closing here are just some ways I think this can change you. Some application. Number one, it means this. It means that suffering is not meaningless. Right? Our world today says avoid suffering. Suffering has no meaning. The gospel, what Jesus did, says otherwise. It says suffering can be used powerfully to change the world. You see, the world says either with suffering, from the East, the Eastern religions and ideologies say you need to deny suffering, it's an illusion, it's not real. In the West, we're taught to avoid suffering. But Jesus shows us what we do with suffering is we love into suffering. We accept it, we submit our wills to God in order that we could love others and the glory of God would be displayed. So can I ask you, in your life right now, do you know suffering? If you do, ask God to align His will with your will in order that He give you strength to bear up through it. And as you do that, you'll understand something of the mystery and the glory of God's suffering on the cross. So love into suffering and ask God to give you strength. Secondly, this passage means that you've not been abandoned by God. Many of us, at times, we feel alone. We feel, oh, God has lost me. I'm alone in this world, and God no longer sees me. I'm abandoned by Him. This passage, the Garden of Gethsemane, says no, God has not abandoned you. At a time when we abandon God, and don't think for a minute you'd be any different than Peter, James, and John. At a time when we abandon God, God chose not to abandon us. And that applies to this day. Right? God has not abandoned you. He knows where you are. And so if you feel alone, if you think that no one is with you, know this, you're not. And not only is that true with God, He's not seeing you, but as He calls you to be a part of a community, we want to be a community that also are your brothers and sisters, and we will not abandon each other. Lastly, it also means that you're not guilty. Right? Jesus drank the cup of God's wrath. That is the cup of the wrath against sinners. And so if you feel the weight of your sin and you are in Christ Jesus, know this. You do not stand in a place of guilt before Christ because He drank the cup for you. So practically that means that when you have regrets about things you've done, you look at your sin and you think, oh, I made a mess of things. I regret what I've done. I feel so shameful and guilty. Practically, to remove that guilt, because that guilt is not of God. God does not want us to have a guilty conscience. Why? Because Christ drank the wrath of God against sinners. So bring that to Him and claim the promises that you are forgiven. Why are you forgiven? Because Christ drank the cup. And He chose to do that in the garden. The story of the Garden of Gethsemane, it's a precious story. It really is, isn't it? It's true. It tells it describes the reality, properly diagnoses our human condition. It tells us the way the world truly is. The problems of our world begin and really end with us, each of us. But lastly and amazingly, it tells us of a